Welcome to the deep dive. If you've ever scrolled through your feed and just, felt that knot of anxiety because you realized two completely different news organizations were describing the same event as if they happened on two different planets, then this deep dive is for you.
It really is. We're trying to move beyond the frustration, beyond just the easy accusation of bias. We've got a whole stack of academic research, computational studies, and some really interesting psychological deep dives here to uncover the structural mechanics of how news actually becomes slanted.
Yeah, this is about understanding the system, right? Not just complaining about the result.
Exactly.
And the urgency here is, it's palpable. Let's just acknowledge the crisis of trust up front. The data shows that 9 in 10 Americans now believe the media is biased.
9 in 10, that's a staggering number.
It is, and confidence in mass media is currently at its lowest point since 2016. That lack of faith in a shared reality, it just creates genuine societal friction.
It absolutely does.
Yeah.
I mean, when the public doesn't trust the basic information they're consuming, their ability to make informed decisions, whether it's about voting or public health or economic policy, it's just severely impaired.
Of course.
If news coverage is systematically biased, it acts as a kind of filter on reality, and it prevents citizens from building a coherent, shared foundation of facts.
So our mission today is pretty surgical. We are not here to debate which side is more biased. We're here to establish the academic definitions, to track the mechanics of how bias emerges through the entire news production pipeline, and then to analyze the surprising economic incentives that drive it.
And then finally, we'll look at some of the cutting-edge tools being developed to maybe detect and mitigate it.
Exactly. So to start, we need a clear framework. Where do we even begin?
Well, social science research typically categorizes media bias into two sort of foundational forms. It's all about distinguishing between what is covered and how it is covered.
Okay, let's unpack those two fundamentals.
So first, we have what's called gatekeeping bias. You'll also hear it called selection bias or agenda bias. This is purely about the decision to select or reject stories for reporting.
So it dictates what even enters the public conversation.
Precisely. It determines what enters the conversation and what remains invisible. Think about it. If a massive, complex event happens, and maybe only 10% of the possible facts are selected for publication, that 90% omission, that is the result of gatekeeping.
Okay, so if a major political scandal breaks, and one outlet decides to bury it on page 17, while another puts it right on the front page, that's gatekeeping bias in action. They're controlling the agenda.
That's a perfect example. And the second type is statement bias, or sometimes presentation bias. This takes over once a story has actually been selected.
So this is the how.
This is the how. It's the choice of how the articles report on the concepts. This covers the tone, the adjectives you use, the quantity of coverage, the specific facts you emphasize, and, maybe most powerfully, the framing.
Framing is so insidious because it often works outside of our conscious awareness. I think to illustrate the immediate, just shocking impact of presentation, we really have to look at that classic behavioral economics scenario from Kahneman and Tversky.
Oh, this experiment is essential. I mean, it is absolutely essential because it shows that statement bias doesn't even need a political slant to work. It works on just, universal cognitive psychology.
So set the scene for us.
They presented participants with this hypothetical scenario. 600 people are endangered by a dangerous virus, and there are 2 program options to combat it.
Okay.
In frame 1, the options were presented in terms of lives saved, so it's emphasizing a gain.
Yeah.
Option A was 200 people will be saved. Option B, there is a 1/3 probability that 600 people will be saved, and a 2/3 probability that no one will be saved.
A sure thing versus a gamble.
Right. And in this framing, we see risk aversion. A huge majority, 72% of participants, chose the certain outcome, option A. They wanted to save those 200 lives for sure. They preferred the guaranteed gain.
But then they did a second survey with an objectively identical scenario, but they framed it in terms of deaths, emphasizing the loss.
Exactly. Now, in this frame, option C was 400 people will die, and option D was there was a 1/3 probability that nobody will die and a 2/3 probability that 600 people will die.
And the shift was just dramatic.
The preference for certainty just vanished. When they were faced with losses, with potential deaths, people suddenly became risk-seeking. The majority now chose the gamble, option D.
Even though mathematically saving 200 is the exact same thing as 400 dying.
It's identical. But merely changing the linguistic lens from save to die fundamentally reversed human decision-making. And that right there, that's the power of framing. It shows that the mechanics of statement bias can alter rational thought, even when the underlying objective facts are completely identical.
That transition from objective reality to subjective perception is, I think, what the contextual model of the news production process really tries to map. So let's move into that, into how an event, the reality, becomes a news item, the perception. This model gives us a kind of roadmap to where bias systematically sneaks in.
It does. This model is so crucial because it organizes the 9 specific forms of media bias that researchers track, and it shows you exactly where they emerge across 3 production phases. But before we break down the phases, we have to understand the pressures that are operating on the entire cycle.
You mean the internal and external forces driving the bias?
Right, the whole system is under pressure. So the internal factors, they start with the individuals making the day-to-day decisions.
Right. The journalists, the editors, they're not robots.
Exactly. News producers, journalists, editors, they are not blank slates. They have their own political, ideological, and socioeconomic views. And these views, well, they inevitably permeate their judgments about story selection and presentation.
It's just natural human behavior.
It is. But it becomes bias when those personal views distort the facts that are being presented to the public.
And we can't ignore the career incentive side of that internal bias either.
Absolutely not. A journalist might consciously or, unconsciously introduce bias if they feel that the resulting story and its alignment with their outlet's editorial position is supportive of their career trajectory.
Or their visibility or future job prospects.
For sure. If the company is ideologically committed to narrative A, and supporting narrative A means you get a promotion, that creates a really clear personal incentive to slant the coverage.
Okay, so those are the internal forces. What about the external ones, the sort of invisible hands shaping the whole process?
Well, external factors involve various powerful parties. So political actors, economic elites, advertisers, they can directly or indirectly influence the cycle. This often shows up as what's known as the propaganda model.
A theory that the news is essentially filtered through systemic constraints that serve elite interests.
That's the one. These constraints include things like ownership concentration, a reliance on advertising, and sourcing practices that tend to favor government and corporate voices. These forces ensure that the content produced, often just structurally, aligns with the dominant institutional priorities.
Okay, that context really sets the stage. So let's break down the 3 production phases, starting with phase 1, the gathering of information. This seems like the epicenter of that gatekeeping bias you mentioned.
It is. The very first step is event selection. I mean, just imagine the sheer volume of occurrences worldwide on any given day. It's an overwhelming stream of events, and from that, only a tiny, tiny fraction can become news. This selectivity is inherently subjective. It's the first step toward biased coverage.
So how do researchers even begin to measure that initial selection bias? How can you compare the news coverage to some kind of objective baseline?
That's the real challenge, which is why social science researchers have to rely on verifiable, non-media data sets. For example, to analyze event selection bias when it comes to protests or demonstrations, researchers don't just compare one newspaper to another.
What do they do?
They compare the number of times the media covered a protest against the verified count of protests logged in official records, like police reports. This allows them to actually quantify the gap between reality, the police reports, and media reality, the coverage.
That comparison must be fascinating. What are the key factors that determine if an event actually makes the cut based on those studies?
They found some very clear impact factors. The frequency of coverage is highly correlated with the event scale, specifically the size of the demonstration. Also, the issue of the event matters dramatically. Protests that are specifically targeting the legislative body, for instance, they tend to receive disproportionately high coverage.
Because they represent a direct conflict with institutional power.
Exactly. So when a protest is large, and it's directly challenging the seat of power, it's almost guaranteed to get coverage, regardless of the merits of the protest itself.
And what's the third factor?
The third factor is crucial for perpetuating bias: previous media attention. News organizations tend to cover what is already salient, what is already generating conversation. This creates a kind of self-reinforcing loop where an initial event gains attention, and then subsequent similar events are prioritized simply because the topic is already hot.
Okay, and within this gathering phase, there are two other critical forms of bias related to information control.
Yes, source selection and then the twin biases of omission and commission of information. Source selection is the decision of whose voices to include, who gets quoted as an expert, who gets quoted as a victim, and who gets completely ignored.
So if a story on environmental policy only features voices from corporate lobbyists and no voices from environmental advocates, that's clear source selection bias.
That's it, in a nutshell. And then omission and commission deal with the specific facts within the story. Omission is explicitly leaving out facts that might contradict the desired narrative.
And commission.
Commission is explicitly including facts, often irrelevant ones, just to sensationalize or undermine a subject. These are deliberate choices made by editors and reporters, often driven by organizational political leanings or, economic motives to create a more dramatic headline.
So now we move to phase two, writing. This feels like the linguistic battlefield where statement bias goes micro level. It's all about language and rhetoric.
This is where we transition from what is reported to how it's reported. The bias here can range from the concept level, for example, consistently showing a specific politician is incompetent, all the way to the article level, which is the overall emotional versus factual tone.
And the primary mechanism here is labeling and word choice. I think we need to spend some time defining the actual tools journalists use to inject spin.
One of the clearest ways to understand this is through the concepts of per words and snarl words. I love these terms. They perfectly define the mechanism of biased wording by spin.
Okay, let's start with per words.
Per words are adjectives or nouns used to describe something that's favored or supported by the reporter or outlet. They inject positive spin, and they imply approval without you ever explicitly stating an opinion.
So describing a policy as forward-thinking or innovative or compassionate.
Exactly. Those words are inherently subjective, and they're designed to elicit a warm, favorable response from you, the reader, the per.
And then the opposite, snarl words.
Snarl words are used to describe something that is hated, opposed, or criticized. These inject negative spin. They often invoke anger or disgust or disdain, the snarl. Describing that same policy as radical, costly, or heavy-handed instantly shifts the perception, even if the objective details of the policy are identical. They're incredibly effective tools for manipulating emotional response.
A great way to visualize this is the contrast in how different outlets covered the same event, like terrorism, using these linguistic choices.
Oh, that study comparing terrorism coverage across major U.S. and U.K. outlets is so revealing. The New York Times, for example, often used a more dramatic, narrative-driven tone. They tended to dehumanize terrorists in their wording by avoiding ascribing any understandable motive to the attacks.
Instead, they'd use metaphors.
Exactly. They prefer powerful metaphors like comparing the conflict to David and Goliath. This heightened the sense of existential threat and moral clarity. It creates a really clear, emotional narrative that's designed for rapid consumption.
Whereas other outlets were more subdued.
Right. Contrast that with the Washington Post, which generally maintained a less dramatic tone. But the real divergence came from publications like the Financial Times and The Guardian. Their articles tended to focus almost exclusively on highly factual, evidence-based reporting. They'd often dig into the socioeconomic or political causes rather than the dramatic conflict.
So the exact same event generates three entirely different emotional and intellectual perceptions just based on word choice.
Purely on linguistic choices in Phase 2.
Which brings us to phase three, editing. This is where bias is determined not by words, but by visual and structural decisions that assign importance.
This phase involves three key forms of bias. The first is placement and size allocation. The physical location in print, or the digital position on a homepage, and the size allocated to the story are all editorial judgments. They signal the value and importance an outlet assigns to something. A story buried deep on a website or given a tiny column inch is structurally minimized no matter how important it is objectively.
So it's another form of gatekeeping, but it's applied after the story's already been written. You're basically deciding its shelf life and visibility.
Precisely. The second is the bias in picture selection. The use of emotional, evocative pictures and their size instantly influences your attention and perception. You can use a flattering, authoritative photo of a politician or an unflattering one taken mid-yawn. That visual choice immediately impacts how the text is read.
But the most potent, and maybe the most easily overlooked, is the bias in picture explanation, the caption.
And this is where that famous anecdote from Hurricane Katrina back in 2005 provides such a chilling illustration. Two very similar pictures were circulated in the U.S. media. They both showed survivors wading away from a partially submerged grocery store with bags of food. I mean, the visuals were virtually identical.
But the context assigned by the caption just fundamentally altered the moral interpretation of the act.
It did. The picture featuring a black man was captioned that he looted the store. The picture featuring a white couple was captioned that they found food. This single choice of a snarl word, looted, versus a neutral verb, found, explicitly changed the action from criminal theft to permissible foraging based solely on the race of the subject.
Wow. The picture itself was neutral. The editorial decision to assign a caption based on existing stereotypes created the bias.
It's so powerful. It demonstrates the culmination of the whole process. Selection, linguistic framing, and editorial packaging all converge to create the final perception.
Which brings us to the summation of all these preceding forms, spin bias.
Exactly. Spin represents the overall aggregated perception of an article. It's not just the sum of those 9 component biases, selection, omission, commission, labeling, and so on. It also incorporates elements like the order in which information is presented and the emphasis given to certain facts within the piece. It's that vague, overarching bias that defines the final narrative slant.
Okay, now that we understand the pipeline, we have to address the motive. Section 3 asks that core economic question. Is media bias driven by editorial preference, the supply, or is it driven by reader clicks, the demand? Are editors pushing an agenda, or are they just giving the audience the clickbait they crave?
This is, I think, arguably the most critical question in media economics today, especially in the digital age. I mean, if bias is demand-driven, the solution involves consumer literacy. But if it's supply-driven, the solution involves structural reform and accountability for media ownership.
And there was a landmark study that provided some incredibly robust evidence to untangle this by looking at the homepage curation of 2 ideologically opposed national newspapers, the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal.
Right. They analyzed over 100,000 articles from both outlets, and they correlated that data with 22 million associated tweets. And the tweets were key because they provided an immediate, real-time measure of consumer demand and article popularity.
So what was the key finding that settled the supply versus demand debate, at least for these elite publications?
Well, the key finding confirmed that supply-driven bias is the dominant factor in homepage gatekeeping. And here's why this is so groundbreaking. The researchers specifically controlled for popularity.
So they took clicks out of the equation.
They did. Even when articles were generating huge consumer engagement, those articles that aligned with the newspaper's political stance stayed significantly longer on the homepage. Liberal-leaning articles in the NYT and conservative-leaning articles in the WSJ received prolonged visibility, which proves editorial preference shapes visibility more than raw reader popularity does.
So the editor is not just reacting to clicks. The editor is actively curating the agenda that the clicks are then reacting to.
Precisely. They are dictating the supply of news that sets the conversation. And we have a really clear example contrasting the longevity of stories in this study.
Okay, let's look at the New York Times example first.
The NYT ran an article on the January 6th, 2021 events, and it framed the incident as an attack on American democracy. This article aligned perfectly with the paper's institutional editorial stance. It was featured prominently, and it remained on the digital front page for over 2 days.
2 days! That's a long time in the digital news cycle.
It is. That extended visibility suggests a very strong editorial preference for keeping that narrative salient in the public consciousness.
Okay, so now compare that to a conservative-aligned article on the Wall Street Journal.
So the WSJ covered the tragic deaths of migrants found in a tractor trailer in San Antonio. The article quoted a Republican governor who explicitly blamed the deaths on President Biden's border policies. Now, this article was initially far more popular.
More popular than the January 6th story.
Way more. It had more than 600 tweet shares by noon, compared to only 200 for the NYT article we just discussed. Yet the WSJ published the article and removed it from the homepage within 2 hours.
2 hours? That is a staggering difference. If the WSJ was purely demand-driven, that article would have stayed up for much longer because the traffic was there.
It absolutely should have. The decision to pull the article so quickly, despite its high early popularity, demonstrates a gatekeeping decision. An editorial preference not to keep that specific, highly partisan message visible. This just robustly confirms that editors are the primary architects of the narrative, not just servants of the click economy.
I think a lot of listeners, myself included, assume that since the rise of digital media, profitability means all bias must be demand-driven clickbait. This study really flips that assumption on its head, at least for major outlets.
It reinforces the role of institutional power. But the study also provided a fascinating moderating factor: competition.
How does competition affect this supply-driven bias?
Well, when both the NYT and the WSJ covered the exact same news story, their individual tendency to prioritize politically aligned articles actually diminished.
Interesting.
When they were forced to compete on identical facts, their institutional biases were somewhat mitigated. This suggests that a diversity of ownership and genuine competition acts as a kind of check on editorial overreach.
Which gives us a pretty chilling implication about media consolidation.
Precisely. If competition mitigates supply-driven bias, then the extensive media consolidation we've witnessed over the last few decades, where fewer and fewer corporations own more and more outlets, must necessarily exacerbate media bias. Reduced competition provides an environment where those entrenched supply-driven editorial preferences can just flourish without the pressure of a balanced competitor.
Okay, let's shift away from explicit ideological preference for a second and look at the purely psychological drive for spin. This brings us to the cognitive miser theory, which is all about efficiency, not politics.
Right. The cognitive miser theory describes the human tendency to think and solve problems using simpler, less effortful methods. Our brains, as highly sophisticated machines, are always seeking shortcuts. They're miserly with cognitive energy to avoid strain.
So, faced with the infinite complexity of the news cycle, readers default to categorical thought. We want simple narratives that confirm what we already believe.
And that's the non-ideological spin for the sake of memorability. If a newspaper wants its story to stick, to be memorable, it will manipulate the news to make sure it matches your existing mental categories or priors. It's an editorial choice driven by maximizing the stickiness of the story.
And the case study involving the NBA star Allen Iverson back in 2002 is a perfect demonstration of this. The first mover advantage and category confirmation.
It really is. The initial story was highly sensationalized. Iverson allegedly kicked his wife out and then broke into an inner-city apartment brandishing a gun. And crucially, this story fit the pre-existing negative category the media had spent years cultivating around Iverson, that thug lifestyle narrative.
So the press just pounced.
They pounced, and the story went viral immediately. The demand for the story was already primed because it confirmed an existing bias.
But what did the later, less covered facts reveal?
The facts that emerged in court completely undercut the sensational story. The judge threw out most of the criminal charges. Testimony confirmed Iverson paid the rent and he had the right to enter the apartment. And most damningly for the reporting, one accuser admitted to lying to the police.
Wow.
And another accuser had consulted a personal injury lawyer before even calling the police 10.5 hours after the alleged incident.
So the initial sensational narrative, even though it was based on shaky evidence and questionable accusers, became the dominant narrative because it confirmed the stereotype.
Exactly. The story stuck because it reinforced the category. The truth was boring. A relative looking for a relative in the house of a relative, as the judge put it. But the sensational lie confirmed the prior. This just highlights the dangers of the first mover advantage in reporting, where speed and narrative alignment trump factual verification, purely for the sake of cognitive efficiency and memorability.
The Iverson case really shows that powerful psychological inertia of stereotypes. So now, let's jump into the modern age with Section 4. Measuring and analyzing polarization, using computational power to analyze this phenomenon at scale.
The sheer volume of data being processed today is just incredible. Researchers use sophisticated machine learning techniques to analyze 1.8 million headlines from major U.S. news outlets between 2014 and 2022. And the quantitative evidence is now overwhelming. Polarization is growing steadily,
Particularly around what?
particularly surrounding domestic politics and social issues.
We often feel that the echo chamber is getting stronger. What did the data confirm about that feeling?
Well, one researcher summarized the findings very succinctly.
Sure.
The echo chamber is very strong. The computational analysis provides objective confirmation that the language, the topics, the frames used by different outlets are moving further and further apart over time, creating two increasingly distinct media realities for consumers.
And we have some very specific computational content analysis findings focusing on TV news polarization over a decade, from 2013 to 2023, comparing broadcast and cable. What did that study find about the major broadcast networks?
The stability of the legacy broadcast networks, ABC, CBS, NBC, is one of the most interesting findings. The polarization between them remains relatively low and stable. They tend to adhere to a shared set of journalistic norms, which results in less divergence in their overall content and language choices.
But the moment you look at cable news, that stability just fractures.
It's a massive shift. Polarization between cable news and broadcast is increasing dramatically, and within cable, the key divergence is Fox News Channel, FNC. FNC has strikingly diverged from CNN and MSNBC.
And what about CNN and MSNBC?
Surprisingly, they've actually converged with each other in their coverage patterns and language usage. The cable environment is increasingly bifurcated, and it's really around FNC's agenda setting.
What's truly counterintuitive about what is fueling this growing chasm? I mean, you would assume the polarization is driven by the shouting matches on primetime opinion shows.
That's the common assumption. But the computational analysis revealed that the increase in polarization between cable and broadcast news is driven more by hard news programming, so the daytime reporting, the actual anchor segments, than by the talk and opinion shows.
Really?
Yeah, and this difference became particularly stark following the spike that was observed right after 2016. The editorial choices, even when they're presenting facts, are just diverging significantly.
Let's look at some qualitative examples researchers pulled out of the transcripts to show how the language diverges in practice. Let's start with the Mueller investigation. How did the language create different realities for the viewers?
The language used in segments with high polarization scores showed a really clear effort to either discredit or validate the investigation. On FNC, for example, segments frequently characterized the Mueller investigation using extreme snarl words, calling it a smear job and a hoax. That linguistic choice was designed to immediately delegitimize the entire process for the viewer.
While the counter-narrative on, say, MSNBC reinforced the gravity of the investigation.
Exactly. MSNBC segments with high polarization focused on terms designed to imply criminality and a threat to the state. They'd emphasize criminal enterprise and obstruction of justice. These distinct labels were used to frame the exact same legal process, generating two entirely separate perceptions of its purpose and legitimacy.
And we see the same pattern played out in social issues like the family separation policy.
Oh, absolutely. When outlets covered this highly emotional topic, they used entirely different frames to drive polarization. FNC's high polarization segments often focused on the professionalism, the efficiency, and the difficulty of the work being performed by border agents.
So they're distancing the agents from the policy.
Right. They emphasized the need for policy enforcement, and they distanced the individual agents from the policies they were enacting.
And CNN focused on the humanitarian crisis, maximizing the emotional response.
Yes. CNN's high polarization segments emphasized the profound human cost. They'd frequently use terms like inhumane and humanitarian crisis, focusing heavily on the plight of young children separated from their parents. They often quoted phrases designed to reinforce that emotional narrative, like highlighting the lack of a plan to reunite families. Clearly no plan to roll it back, right? That's why you still have 3,000 kids without their parents.
So the language determines whether the crisis is seen as a matter of policy enforcement or a matter of moral failure.
That's it exactly.
To bring this out of the computational lab and into a real-world high-stakes accountability example, let's discuss that recent crisis involving the BBC, a state-funded broadcaster known globally for its neutrality standards.
This crisis serves as such a vivid lesson that no institution, regardless of its reputation, is immune to editorial pressure and the perception of bias. The incident that sparked the firestorm involved the editing of a Donald Trump speech from January 6th.
What exactly did the BBC do that led to such severe political fallout?
The BBC's chair eventually conceded that an edited video of the speech was spliced together and then broadcast without informing viewers that the video had been edited. And the edit specifically created the impression of a direct call for violent action by cutting out key contextual phrases.
That is profound statement bias,
Yeah.
a manipulation of presentation.
It is. And the result was massive political blowback. It led to high-level resignations and, critically, a threatened $1 billion defamation lawsuit from Trump, who used the incident as a high-profile attack on media integrity.
But the crisis deepened beyond just the lawsuit. It highlighted internal structural problems, didn't it?
Absolutely. The event became a lightning rod for pre-existing internal conflicts. Critics used the incident to claim systemic bias within the organization, pointing to a leaked memo from a former standards advisor. The crisis also exposed the influence of external political opponents exploiting the situation, pointing specifically to the appointment of a BBC board member who had previously served as a communications chief for a conservative prime minister.
And helped establish a rival right-wing broadcaster.
Yeah, exactly. It just illustrates how structural bias can be institutionalized through political appointments overseeing editorial decisions.
Okay, so we've covered that bias is structural, psychological, and economic, and we can now measure its rapid growth computationally. But what do we do about it? This brings us to Section 5, Media Literacy, Awareness, and Mitigation.
Well, the societal goal remains constant. Informed citizens need unrestricted access to balanced information. But the primary obstacle, as we discussed earlier, isn't necessarily the media institution. It's the reader's own cognitive machinery.
And that machinery is dominated by the hostile media perception, or HMP. Let's spend a moment defining the psychology behind this massive cognitive hurdle.
HMP is rooted in what's called social identity theory. When people hold strong political or ideological viewpoints, when those views become tied to their social identity, articles that contradict those views feel like an attack on the group they belong to, not just a disagreement over facts.
So if the media criticizes my group's leader or my group's policy, my mind classifies that article as intentionally hostile and therefore biased.
Precisely. You perceive articles that contradict your political viewpoint as more biased than those that align with it, even if the degree of actual spin is identical. The perception of bias is driven by in-group favoritism and the need to protect our social identity. This makes genuine self-correction extremely difficult.
Because we're basically neurologically programmed to trust our sources and distrust the opposition's sources.
It's a huge hurdle. So, given this deeply ingrained human cognitive barrier, researchers have turned to automated methods, testing interventions for readers using various visual and textual aids. What methods were actually effective at increasing media bias awareness?
Did any of them work?
2 tools showed some positive results in increasing awareness. First, text annotations. This involves algorithms that specifically highlight biased words and attach a brief, objective explanation. For example, calling a subjective term like radical a phrase skewed by feeling, opinion, or taste. This explicit identification helped participants detect subtle biases, particularly in ambiguous cases.
Okay, and the second effective tool was simpler, just a forewarning.
Yes, forewarning messages. Simply informing people before they read an article that they were about to read potentially biased coverage increased their perceived bias.
Sure.
This upfront notification acted as a kind of cognitive prompt, encouraging conscious reflection and critical reading from the outset.
What about the most straightforward method of just classifying the article politically with a label?
That was found to be largely ineffective. A simple bar label classifying an article as politically left or right-oriented showed absolutely no significant effect on perceived bias ratings. This just reinforces the idea that it's the specific identification of biased language, the how that matters, not just the who or the where.
And here is the truly sobering finding that connects back to the power of HMP. Did any of these effective awareness tools actually break the partisan bubble?
They did not. Crucially, none of the visual aids, not the annotations, the forewarning, or the classification bar, managed to reduce the partisan rating effect. Readers still perceived articles from the opposing political viewpoint as significantly more biased than articles that confirm their own views.
So hostile media perception remains stubbornly resilient.
It's internalized and self-driven.
Since human cognition seems to be the primary roadblock, computer science has shifted focus to move beyond perception and focus on objective, automated quantification. This is where we get into the sophisticated generalizable framework using embedding models. We should probably explain what these technical terms mean before we get into the findings.
Right. This is a major leap in technical analysis. An embedding model is essentially a way to translate words or documents or even entire media outlets into mathematical vectors points in a high-dimensional space. The key principle is that the meaning of a word is defined by the words that surround it.
So if 2 words like scientist and engineer frequently appear near similar words in billions of articles, their vectors, their mathematical coordinates, will be very close together in that space.
Exactly. And the proximity, or the distance, between these vectors allows researchers to objectively quantify abstract concepts like bias or stereotype without any human input. This framework allows for quantification across 2 levels, micro and macro.
Okay, let's start with the micro-level wording bias, using word embeddings to measure subtle stereotypes.
Researchers used word embeddings to measure subtle stereotypes like gender or income bias by analyzing word co-occurrence across U.S. media. For example, they could analyze the distance between the word CEO and gendered pronouns like he or she. If the vectors cluster overwhelmingly toward he, that objectively quantifies the gender bias embedded in the reporting, independent of any human observer's judgment.
And what did the micro-level study confirm regarding income bias toward races and ethnicities in U.S. media?
The study found that media income bias toward races and ethnicities aligns remarkably closely with their actual socioeconomic realities. The media implicitly associated Asians with the highest income levels and African Americans with the lowest income levels. And this isn't just a critique of the media, it's an objective quantification of how journalistic language reinforces existing socioeconomic structures.
That's a crucial point. It raises the question, is the bias inherent in the language, or is the language simply reporting on a biased reality?
Well, academics typically argue it's a feedback loop. By reinforcing these associations, the media isn't just reflecting reality, they are making those stereotypes more salient and easier for the cognitive miser to access, which further entrenches the bias.
Okay, now for the macro-level event selection bias, using media embeddings.
At this level, researchers treat entire media outlets, not individual words, as vectors. They cluster outlets based on the events they choose to report on. If two outlets frequently cover the same set of stories, their media embeddings will be close together. This technique objectively reveals structural biases in agenda setting across entire organizations.
And what did it find?
The finding confirmed that outlets from the same country or the same corporate organization share similar event selection tastes, confirming organizational and geographic gatekeeping biases at a massive scale.
This has been incredibly detailed, spanning psychology, economics, and computer science. To finish this deep dive, we need to provide the learner with actionable advice, concrete steps you can take to counteract the biases we've discussed.
Okay, so the first and most critical action you can take is to diversify your news consumption. You have to consciously step outside your comfort zone. If you rely solely on sources that confirm your existing beliefs, you are actively participating in the supply-demand cycle of bias.
You have to cross-check.
You have to cross-check major stories, especially high-stakes domestic politics, across at least three ideologically distinct sources to get a fairer perspective.
And there are powerful, sophisticated tools specifically designed to help map that diversification journey.
Yes, you should absolutely utilize media bias charts. The two leading organizations are Adfontes Media and All Sides Media. It's important to understand their methodology is different. Adfontes uses a panel of paid analysts who rate articles against defined criteria to determine political lean and factual reliability.
And All Sides.
All Sides uses a multipartisan approach, often incorporating blind surveys and political analysis from experts across the spectrum. But both offer valuable maps, showing you where your current sources sit and where you need to move to achieve balance.
And finally, a piece of advice that addresses the economic roots of the problem and the issue of consolidation. Support local media.
Financial support for local media is vital. Local journalists often operate outside the gravitational pull of the national polarized market forces. They provide essential accountability for local officials and often cover complex topics from different viewpoints, serving as a critical resource for a healthy, functioning, and, less ideologically driven democracy.
This has been a necessary, I think, and very deep examination into the machinery of media bias. We've established that it is a complex structural issue driven simultaneously by the editorial supply prioritizing alignment and by the psychological demand for simple narratives and identity confirmation.
And we are entering a new era where technology provides objective quantification tools, from micro-level word choice analysis all the way to macro-level event selection mapping. Our knowledge of these mechanisms is growing rapidly.
But the primary challenge remains profoundly cognitive. That hostile media perception, our default mode, is incredibly resistant. We are inherently more vigilant about the bias in the articles we disagree with, easily classifying them as fake, while passively absorbing the spin from the sources we instinctively trust.
So, the enduring question for you, the learner, is this. Since automated tools could not mitigate the partisan effect of HMP and our brains are programmed to conserve effort, what specific personal techniques or critical thinking habits must you develop to check your own internal tendency to be more vigilant about the bias in the articles you instinctively trust than in those you instinctively oppose?
How do you apply the critical rigor you reserve for your opponent's sources to your own? That's the cognitive challenge we leave you with. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.